Good morning, everybody. My name is Christy Barber, and I have a friend of mine today, Kelly Davis, who is the sales tax guy. So I'm really excited for this conversation today. He comes with, 10 years experience in the sales tax world, meaning all of the software that goes into it, some of the understanding of all the laws and all of that's ever changing. And so thank you so much for being here today. Like I said, I'm excited to talk about all things sales tax because it is something that for a lot of small businesses is a little bit scary to talk about because there's so much unknowns there.
Absolutely. Well, Christy, I'm super excited. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah. So if you want to just share a little bit of how'd you get into this sales tax world and your journey into it.
Yeah, so it's a very kind of interesting. I've always been in sales, so I'm not a licensed CPA or anything like that. I've just helped a lot of big companies for a very long time around sales tax and sales tax automation. And so I started off as a car mechanic. I liked cars. I built a hot rod in high school and wanted to do that kind of in my indefinite life. And then after I kind of did the dream job and worked out a hot rod shop and got married and had my first kid, realized that I didn't want to be really old and not be able to bend over and stuff. There's a lot of, mechanics, the joints aren't very good when they get older. So pivoted into sales and went from place to place to place and tried to get into medical sales. And then I had a coworker that introduced me to, said, hey, I interviewed for this company called TTR, stood for Transaction Tax Resource over in Oregon. He said, I wasn't really interested in it, but maybe you like it. And so I went and I interviewed and I thought it was a great company and I knew absolutely nothing about it and found out that they sold a sales tax software. And I said, sure. They were taking a lot of people that didn't really know anything about sales tax and saying, hey, we have a great tool that teaches people about sales tax and you can try to sell it. And I said, okay. And so that's what we did. They had a tool that provided a plain English answer to the question of whether or not somebody was selling something was taxable or exempt. And then they provide all the laws and the research associated to that. And so I worked there for about 5 years selling that software to a bunch of Fortune 1000 really big companies and helping them with their questions around sales tax and sales tax taxability things and different scenarios that came up. That company had a competing product to Avalara's exemption certificate management solution. And we like to kind of brag at the time that the other company, Transaction Tax Resource, had a better product because Walmart picked our product over Avalara's.
Nice.
And so then Avalara shortly after bought the company. And so we went from, selling against Avalara, then I was selling Avatax. And so I did that for about another 5 years, helping companies. I was assigned into the NetSuite ecosystem at Avatax. So I sold Avatax and all its associated products to lots of companies that use NetSuite. And I did that for 5 years until I decided to part ways with Avalara. And I had a coworker that was working at CereTax at the time and said, hey, you would really like this company. Learned a little bit about it. And I said, absolutely. And so I jumped on board and I came over here to CereTax. I've been here for about a year now. And so, yeah, so that's kind of my history of how I fell into this world. I went from a point of not knowing anything about, really sales tax, being from Oregon, we joked that we didn't have sales tax in Oregon. So we have enough time to help everyone else with sales tax. I learned about use tax when I was at that company.
Oh, yeah.
That was a mind-blowing thing. I said, what? You can't even run away from this stuff. Even when you buy the stuff, there's tax. I said, that's mind-boggling to me. It was really interesting. My first experience with sales tax was I was probably about 8, 9 years old. I went to Disneyland in California from Oregon, where I grew up. And I remember something was like $4.99, and my parents gave me $5. Mm-hmm. So I go up to the counter and buy whatever Mickey Mouse thing off of Main Street. And they said it was like $5.18. And I was like, what? They're like, it's sales tax. I was like, what is this thing? So I'd go back and ask more money from my parents and ended up getting it. But it was like, that was first experience. I had no clue what it was. So that was really interesting. So.
That is one of those as a kid. You're like, well, I have enough money to buy this. This is fantastic. You're like, just kidding.
Like, no, I need Mickey. It was really fun.
That is awesome. I think one of the biggest things is just talking about the small business world and how it's really growing, especially in the e-commerce world. And e-commerce is so unique when it comes to sales tax.
Yep.
And for the longest time, I know there wasn't really much software out there in the beginning years of it. And if there was, it was very expensive, and it was only for the larger companies that could really afford it. And I know a lot of people use the Avatax. That's kind of become the standard name out there. You see it advertised on, billboards and places at the airport, usually, since people don't watch ads on TV. They gotta go other places now to get your attention.
Yep.
But I think that's something, there's such a big misconception about sales tax for the people that are just starting out. There's ideas that, oh, hey, I use Shopify, it's going to collect my tax for me. Or I use TikTok, TikTok's going to pay my taxes for me. Because when you do sell on Amazon, I know Amazon will do that. You can sign up and, they'll take care of you. But for the guys that don't understand that, what have you seen when they kind of come and they're searching for software and some of those questions, and how you help guide them in knowing, all right, we need to get you set up on a solution, because running in the background some Excel reports is going to be difficult?
Yeah, it's very different from what it was, 10 years ago, when Wayfair recently rolled out. When I started here at, 2015 is kind of when I started. And when the Wayfair Act finally rolled out, and how big, sales tax suddenly became an issue, where a lot of people just simply said, hey, I have an e-commerce shop. I just need to sell, have the rate for my local area, which is 6% or whatever it is. Everyone was familiar with the sales tax rate of where they lived. But then suddenly, when you have to start figuring out what sales tax is across all the different states, and you're selling maybe a keychain or, so whatever it is on a small e-com platform, you suddenly have to then say, holy cow, I have to know all these tax rules and all these different taxability things across the whole US. And that got really complicated for a lot of businesses. And that's where these types of softwares became really important. One of the most important things I would say in for any small business that's starting up is this isn't really something you can necessarily kick down the road for long.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not on day one, you need to be sales tax compliant or anything like that. But as businesses grow and all of a sudden your product and your services or whatever is likely a product online starts to take off, it needs to be something on your forefront of your mind. And that's really where these software start to kind of come into place. And we have now a lot more options besides just Avalara. CereTax is a great option to be able to look into that provides an inexpensive alternative to really allow any website, any platform to really integrate into a solution that provides that insight and capability. Because the most complex thing is really figuring out, okay, what is the rate that I need to apply? Is there special rates? What's the filing compliance, deadlines? All those different types of things are things that you don't really know outside of just one state. And then suddenly for e-com platform, you can be exposed to a ton of states. And it's really confusing when some platforms like Amazon will collect tax and you say, okay, well, does the Walmart platform do as well? Does Etsy do it? Well, what about my website? What do I need to put on the returns? A lot of people aren't necessarily aware of, okay, well, I'm selling on Amazon, but I also have a Shopify website, and realize I need to still report the numbers that I sell on Amazon to New York when I file my New York return with my e-com platform.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of these kind of nuances that people aren't necessarily aware of, that these softwares come into place and help you be compliant in a very cost-effective manner.
Yeah. And I think that's the tricky part too, is just that understanding of, yeah, Amazon does this for me, but I still have to report that I earned that revenue. And then when things get filed, it's, cross-reference in the back office of the state. And then you're showing, what you still owe. But it does get tricky. And I think with Shopify, even because that's usually the platform everybody goes to, it's kind of the go-to. It's fairly easy to get set up and go. And it does help monitor in the background to show you, hey, you're nearing a nexus in a particular state, and you're going to have to get a sales tax license and start filing taxes in that particular state. And that is a good reminder for small businesses of Yeah, always go in there and frequently check that. I tell everybody at least once a month, go in and check to make sure you have not hit a new Nexus somewhere, because the worst thing is, time passes by and all of a sudden it's been 5, 6 months and you forgot to look in there. And now you have these back taxes you have to pay. And it doesn't get very kind when you have to go back and ask for forgiveness for penalties and interest and all of that.
Yeah.
But what I do like about your software in particularly is the ability to say, hey, let's consume this data that's from Shopify and then help the owner discern where they need to be paying, and kind of taking that from them and alleviating some of the burden of
Mhm.
knowing, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming. I have 8 states and 20 jurisdictions. I got to make sure I file. And I think that's always the tricky part. In some states, you cross the street, you're in a different tax zone. You go down the street 2 blocks, you're in a different one, and being able to keep up with that.
Yeah, absolutely. It gets very complex. And that's where just the advancement of the technology over the past 10 years has gone leaps and bounds. One of the newer technologies that companies are using is GIS. It's something that our tax engine is using, which stands for Geographic Information Systems. And basically allows you to draw shape files over, say, Google Maps. And so what we've done is our team has gone in and drawn all the taxing jurisdictions across all the different taxes jurisdictions in the US and overlaid them on Google Maps. And so how our software operates, which is kind of the latest and greatest, is it will take an address, you're shipping it to 123, Main Street in, let's say, Chicago, and it will take that address, turn it to a latitude, longitude, and drop a pin on a map, and we can see what shape files it lands on. So we can see, okay, it came through the state of Illinois, the county, Cook County, here's the Chicago one, and then any special districts. And so we kind of see where they overlap, and then we know exactly what rate applies. And so when those complex areas, it really allows the business owner to be rest assured that they're using the most accurate tool and they're getting the right rate every single time. So we can determine on one side of the street, you're within, a special district or within the city rate, as well on the other side of the street, it might be a different one. And so we have that accuracy. And the really unique thing we do is we actually show you that as the user. Is you can say, if a customer says, well, why are you charging me 6.5%? You can show, where the transaction was sourced to, where that dot on the map is, and the shape files that it interacted with. And so you can email that to your customer and say, well, here's why it's 6.5%, where there's no other software on the market that does it. You just get the answer, well, 6.5%, and go research it yourself. So it's very unique, and it gives a lot of reassurance for people that don't know a lot about sales tax to make sure it's working correctly.
Yeah. And there's always those hidden things. And for small business owners, they need to know, okay, what is this number really comprised of? And sometimes there's specific tax rules based on the items that you sell, even in a local jurisdiction or even that state, that, there's different rules, and it's another level of research that then has to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's things that as a business owner, like I didn't even know what use tax was. And also as it was a mind blowing theory to me to think that, holy cow, the state of Colorado has all different home rule cities, right? So at the state, maybe the Kit Kat bar that you're selling is exempt at the state, but Colorado Springs has their own set of rules. And Colorado Springs might say, hey, I know the state exempts it, but we don't. And so you hold it here within Colorado Springs, you need to exempt the sales tax rate at the state, but to charge it at the city. And whether it's 2% or 2%, I don't know what Colorado Springs head is, but those are settings that Shopify isn't set to do, right? BigCommerce, WooCommerce, Magento or Adobe Commerce aren't capable of doing. And that's really where these types of softwares come in to say, we can do it and we can set it up for you. And it's all you do is say, hey, I'm selling a Kit Kat bar. And then we take care of the rest of what states you're collecting, selling that.
Yeah. It's one of those. So then you can sleep easy at night knowing everything's handled correctly.
Yep.
Yeah. Because I had a client that was the opposite of that. The state side would be taxed. The local was you're exempt from everything because of the county.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And there's so many different nuances to these types of things where, And the common example is a candy bar, right? Some states say, hey, if it has flour, it's going to be exempt. Some say if it doesn't have flour, or it does have flour, it will be taxable. And those are unique things that people don't necessarily think of. And so our software are all set up with that different research where we'll say it's a candy bar with flour or without flour, right? Or in Texas, say, do you have 6 donuts or do you have less than 6 donuts? Because there's a cutoff of how they're going to treat it taxability wise, and all these different nuances. And so that's where we've researched, we maintain these, and all you do is take your product and you link it to what's commonly referred to as a tax code. So we know whether you're selling a Kit Kat bar or, a t-shirt or a coffee mug, and then we'll be able to manage it from then on out.
Yeah. And you think too how things have changed, because I remember a lot of times people used to go to a different county to buy a car because you could get lower tax. And now, and I think it's because of Wayfair, you get billed on what your address is. So you going across town really didn't help you unless you were maybe paying cash for something, but still.
Yeah, absolutely. It used to be kind of if you're in the area, you can do that. It was something, I lived in Portland, Oregon. And so, being just across the river, you're in Vancouver, Washington. That was one of those kind of loopholes people can take advantage of. But nowadays, when everything's mailed to you most often the time, or, you're buying it online, a lot of those quote unquote called sourcing rules, where the transaction is sourced to or where that transaction happened and what rules apply, are different, as well as they change occasionally. Some states, being that sales tax is kind of this big leverage now that a lot of states are being able to use for revenue aspects. And some states are saying, hey, I want to scrub income tax. Tennessee, where I now currently live, used to be a state that had income tax, and they got rid of that, a few years ago. And so it's a similar concept with sales tax, where states will say, hey, well, maybe we can reduce property tax or reduce income tax, and then we'll increase sales tax. And so where sales tax, services might be changing, right? What used to be exempt is now going to become taxable. And it's something that as a business owner, you don't necessarily want to stay on top of. You say, hey, I don't want to try to maintain what's going on across all the different states, whether they're changing the tax rate or whether they're changing the taxability of the product or service. And that's where our types of softwares come in, because we maintain all that. We have a small army that researches and stays on top of all the tax law changes across all 50 states or globally. And then we update our software so you don't have to.
Yeah, because otherwise it's a full-time job. I always say that about HR too. When you're the business owner, those are 2 areas that there's so much that's always changing. You don't want to have to, be in the trenches learning all of that. You need to hire somebody that is their specialty, because it's going to save so much time.
Absolutely. Well, and most important thing, I think, is that as these softwares for a small business that's starting up, is they tend to be pretty cost effective. Instead of trying to hire a full-time tax accountant that's $40, $60, $80, $100,000, you can pay for these types of softwares that most often it's kind of a cost of use of, hey, how many transactions are you rolling through? How many states are you in? Each of them tend to price differently, and some will have pricing more favorable than others depending on your specific business. And you tend to be able to find one that's pretty cost effective for, if you're a new startup and you only have a few thousand transactions, it's not going to cost you arm and the leg in order to be sales tax compliant, which will be important, because down the road, it's not, just do I get caught? It's when you get caught.
Exactly. Yeah. And you don't want to have that and have a sales tax audit or any of those things.
Yeah. And, not to try to scare anyone, but, when I've worked with plenty of large companies, I know, there's all sorts of class action lawsuits of, oh, hey, you were charging the wrong rate, right? H&M, Kroger, they all bag fees, plastic fees, all these different types of things. They weren't messing up. They didn't try to do anything wrong on purpose. It was just, it's a complex role, and there's a lot of complexity around it. And the more you can show, hey, I'm ahead of it, I have these different things in place to try to take care of it, the more likely, if those small areas, especially as a small business owner, I wouldn't fret about it. But as long as you have something in place showing your intention, most states understand.
And I think that's a good reminder too, is sometimes software like this feels like it's untouchable for small businesses of, you hear it advertised for the really large companies and just automatically think, oh, I couldn't afford this. But
Mhm.
that's not the truth. And like you said, and like I've seen even with smaller clients too, is it's just negotiating and figuring out what is it that you exactly need, because you don't need it all.
Correct. Absolutely. Because a lot of the products and different services, right?
Hmm.
You can slice and dice it. All the different softwares, they're going to have the ability to calculate sales tax. Almost every single platform that you're using. Then from there, there's sometimes you need to collect exemption certificates or resale certificates
Hmm.
from your customers and be able to help kind of program and automate that if you're doing distribution or wholesale transactions. So some small businesses, they just don't need it right now, right? Hey, you can buy just the calculations, and then you can file the sales tax returns yourself in-house, or you can buy the software and automate it, or you can use a third party, right?
Hmm.
And say, hey, I don't want to take this on, and you can find something that's cost effective that has additional bells and whistles that they might offer
Yeah.
to you as well. So there's a lot of ways to slice and dice it to find the most cost effective approach,
Hmm.
but it shouldn't be that cost scares you off to be able to do it. There is definitely a way that is right for your business, whether it's, hey, you can only afford a few $1,000s, or you can afford millions of dollars for a software, depending on whatever stage of business you are in revenue. There's a cost effective approach to
Yeah.
it.
And I like too, with your solution, it grows with you. So you can start out small, and then one day maybe you have 1 million transactions a month or whatnot. It
Yeah.
scales and grows with you. You don't have to, go look for something else along the way.
Well, and one of the things I really liked about CereTax was the ability of how they price their software out, which was unique compared to a lot of people on the market. A lot of softwares will say, "Hey, we look at the number of times that your software, your website would interact with the software, and they'll count for every estimate, every quote, every abandoned shopping cart, if it's exempt transaction, if not, where you have Nexus, where you don't." It was very complex and of a way of how they priced it. What we do here is we just very simply, what is your total sales, transactions that you're doing within a calendar year, right? So we don't count for your quotes, your abandoned shopping carts. And then the other thing we take into account is your sales tax liability. What are you actually collecting and remitting back to the states? So if you're a wholesale customer, or you have a lot of exempt products that you're selling, right? Maybe a lot of first aid or whatever it might be, countless things that the state's exempt. A lot of software is going to say, hey, we're going to charge you for those.
Right.
Ours, in theory, if you don't have Nexus, so you're not collecting sales tax in a lot of states, if it's not a lot of exempt transaction, or if you're just a small business, right? Are you collecting less than 500,000? Well, you're going to be kind of that startup phase. Or you're a company like Walmart, where you're collecting millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of sales tax liability. We price our solution accordingly. So for many customers, we found that we're kind of the best option, most cost-effective option for many clients.
Yeah. Which is good. And how, if you can speak a little bit of how the solutions integrate with your software, what do those APIs look like once the data comes over? And is there any issues with, how sometimes we talk about a lot of, if the data isn't clean, we're not going to get good results. Is there anything that you help prepare clients of, hey, make sure XYZ is done to ensure that these records are accurate when they're coming over?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the most important part is that for many companies, that whatever solution you use, whether it's SereTax or someone else, is that all the integrations are usually already built. If it's a very popular platform, most of the company has an integration already built. So you don't really have a lot of complex of making sure the data comes over in the right way. It's kind of a plug and play situation. But if you've done a lot of customizations to your platform, or if you have a custom, ERP or website that you've built, then yeah, there is, a lot of kind of hand holding we'll offer to make sure that the data comes over correctly. But once it's set up and it's be able to done and handle whatever customization you've done, all our systems going to be able to produce the data in a very organized way to be able to go into any type of return software to be able to do the returns yourself. So that's the great part with most of all our systems, is that once they're integrated, the data is going to be out clean and ready to go. And if you do something unique or customization, that's really where the nuances between the different companies really come into. A lot of the tax engines out there, they're not a lot of flexibility, right?
Right. Which is good.
Yeah, which is good to agree.
Yeah.
But if you are a business that does, kind of do things a little out of the ordinary. You know, a unique thing about CereTax that I really like for a lot of my customers is we're flexible. We can adapt ours and customize it for you, you know, to a degree, to make it automate for you and be able to really improve a lot of those processes for you. And that's one of the things I really liked.
Yeah, and that is good, because having those good processes in place helps so much, and people don't always realize that out the gate of how important that is.
Yeah, absolutely. As well as I think there is the ability to put some assurance for the business owner that says, hey, there is some flexibility. You know, there is some things that you can do that, you know, most states are going to be okay if there's understanding behind it, right? As long as you're not flying off the rails and trying to hide money or do something that's shady.
Right.
Most states are going to be understand, you know, especially small business owners. So.
One thing I was going to ask you, there was a question that came through, I'll just put it on here, is, and again, I know you're not a CPA or not, but you do see some things just being in the field of the sales side, and probably when people come to you with, you know, the dumpster fires going and they got to go get something taken care of. But just this one, do you think businesses underestimate the damage a sales tax mistake can cause beyond the fine?
Absolutely. And I wouldn't say it's just that a sales tax mistake, but just an audit in general. I mean, it's a huge burden on a business to simply have a state come in amongst all the things and fires you have going on, to suddenly come in and say, I want my stuff and I want it right now, right? Maybe, you know, from producing the data for an audit, right? Answering questions, fielding questions. If the auditor suddenly says, hey, I need this transaction, why did you charge tax? Well, they won't say that, but they'll say, why did you not charge tax? Right? And then you're like, I don't know. It just said it was exempt. I don't know what the heck the software did. You know, there's a lot of frustration that comes up with that. One of the unique things we do is we kind of show you the secret sauce with ours. Our software will say, hey, it's exempt. Here's the reason why it's exempt in plain English, as well as the laws that support why it was exempt at the time the transaction took place. So from an audit defense standpoint, it's a game changer that no other software on the market's doing for sales tax automation. But not only that, but there's, from a cash flow aspect, right? Business might be tight on cash flow. Then suddenly they have to say, oh my gosh, I have to pay a ton of money. And then they have to clean up all of those different types of things that go up with it. And so from cost burden, it's a huge thing, as well as a time burden, as well as there's just kind of, there's, you know, for many small businesses, it's not going to show up on the news, right? But there's been plenty of news articles where bigger companies have had mistakes, and all of a sudden it's posted out on the news. There was where I grew up in Oregon, right? So there was, you know, at the time, there's a small mattress company that was located in Washington, and they were trying to help pay the tax on behalf of the customers at the time. And ended up going out of business because of the complexities and the issues, and all of a sudden the millions of dollars that they had to kind of owe because they weren't doing things right. And so while they didn't think they were doing anything wrong, they didn't check with the CPA to make sure they were doing things right. And it got to be over multiple years such a tax burden that the business couldn't take it, and it had to go under. And it's very unfortunate.
Yeah.
And so it certainly can cause a lot more damage than one thinks if they don't stay on top. And that's where a licensed CPA comes in to make sure, hey, do I have this software set up correctly? Is this working correctly? Is there anything that I need to do? Because unfortunately, every single sales tax software will say, hey, this is our assumption, but the software is never on the hook. It is always going to be up to the business owner to make sure it's working correctly. And that's why we always recommend, and we work with a lot of CPAs to make sure, you know, hey, have someone put eyes on it. That's double checking to make sure it's done correctly. We've done a lot of insight. I got a fair amount of knowledge just helping so many companies over a decade of doing this. That you know, we can make some recommendations, but I'm no CPA. I wouldn't trust me.
Right, that's the same.
Not bad, but
with me as well. I'm not a CP, but I know enough to be dangerous. But I want somebody to come in that is, you know, their level of expertise, and they can speak to it very clearly and say, hey, yep, this looks great, or no, we actually missed this over here.
Yep. And there's some very complex industries, right?
There are.
There's a lot that just needs to go into that insight to make sure things are done correctly.
Yeah. And I think this one also, just kind of piggybacking on all of that, is with the consistent regulatory changes, are people having to, look at a sales tax from a different way when you want to be, really compliant with your strategy?
I think so. So here, do you think constant regulatory changes force compliance to rethink their tax? I would certainly think so, because for some companies it was, hey, sales tax is not a big issue for us, right? It's we're exempt everywhere. We have exemption certificates. I don't need to register because if I get caught, I owe nothing, right? And I'll be
Yeah.
able to prove it under audit. But a lot of people don't go back 3, 4, 5 years later and say, hey, did that change? Did it not? Right?
Mhm.
There's sometimes, even though you are exempt from tax and you have all the exemption certificates, you still need to register. And the government still wants to say, hey, this is my total sales. I'm collecting nothing. So there's a lot of paperwork, but if the state changes or if the laws change and suddenly you became taxable and you weren't aware of it, you have a lot that you have to clean up and a lot of issues. And so it's definitely something that as sales tax becomes more of a revenue generator for states, that there's a lot more pressure put on of switching things to taxable. There's a lot of states out there that are saying, hey, this was exempt, but I've overspent. I need to get more money. And so let's switch some of these things to taxable. There's a lot of states that are going through and changing things to taxable that were normally exempt and is in general exempt across most states. So it's not something
Like, you think, even, what was it, a couple of years ago? I don't know if it was nationwide, but when they decided, remember candy never used to be taxed. And then candy and Coke products and whatever that new law was with like sugar-based foods
yeah.
then got taxed.
Yeah, so that was a big thing in Chicago, the sugar tax
Yeah.
on beverage sodas and things like that, where that is something that Chicago passed, was additional tax just on sugary drinks that they did. And there's a lot that kind of comes and goes, and there's a lot of talk of people saying, hey, let's do it. And then when it actually turns into legislation and people in the government votes on it, sometimes it goes and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it gets repealed. Sometimes it's been enacted and then all of a sudden there's a lawsuit over it. There's been some changes even at local levels. I remember of some states that said, hey, we're going to change it to this rate. And then, there's a big drama over it. I remember around, I think, some of the plastic bag fees and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Where states said, hey, I'm going to start charging for plastic bags. And then there was judges that said, hey, it's not okay to do that. So even though the law was enacted, it was put on pause and all sorts of different things. And so there's all these different examples of stories of nuances that come and go, and creative ways that people will, states will try to charge tax. And then there's all sorts of carve outs for it. Washington, the state of Washington just enacted a bunch of sales tax around different services, and they weren't very clear on what's taxable and what's exempt. And there's a lot of lawsuits. I think two businesses have put lawsuits to the state of Washington saying, hey, you can't do this. And it's frankly just because it was like, we don't understand what you're charging tax on now. And so there's lots of things that have to get settled. And it's a complex environment right now, for sure.
It is. And I think too, when those things go into act, it's hard being a small business as well as, well, did this really go in? Do I need to go update everything so that I'm collecting it? Do I not need to? What does that look like?
Absolutely. And that's where a lot of our, all our software, we maintain and we stay on top of all these types of changes. And so you can be rest assured that says, hey, we're going to be okay. And I think the important thing to note is that all these softwares, they take the more conservative approach. So we'll always be a little bit more careful to charge tax to protect you than to not charge tax.
Yeah.
You can always change it. If you say, hey, I'm clearly okay, or you gotten a letter ruling from a state that says your product is okay to be exempt, you can override whatever these softwares are to make it specific for your unique situation. But in general, it tends to be a little bit safer to charge tax. And if you have a customer disagree with you, deal with that than to, be on the border and take a chance.
And I think one other thing I want to address too is, a lot of times starting out, people, QuickBooks is the go-to software. And QuickBooks can calculate tax to a certain extent, but it can't fully calculate it. And I would say for people out there that are doing that, that's where, as you grow, you could have liability that you're not collecting the correct tax and then be up for audit. And then that goes into a second part of what we kind of talked about, is or just you and I right before this call, is when there are government shutdowns, a lot of times sales tax is what is used to rely on. And to your point, a lot of times that's when the audits could potentially come into play, because now they're looking who has and who hasn't paid sales tax.
Yeah, absolutely. So QuickBooks Online is a great software, right? But the capability of what they're able to do with their sales tax is very limited.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those, hey, if you know the rate of what it is in your area and you're kind of within a local area, you can probably be okay. But the moment you expand and you go anything online, or where you have multiple states or multiple different fact patterns, there's a lot of limitations where QuickBooks and QuickBooks Online just won't be able to meet those needs. And that's where you need a software like ours to be able to come into play. And you're absolutely right. You can either outgrow QuickBooks and move on to a different ERP, something like NetSuite, Rillet. There's countless other ones that are growing up that you can go into. But you're absolutely right. When states are strained for being overspending or not having enough money, one of the big things they're looking at right now is, their sales tax audit. Auditors are going out and saying, hey, who has messed up, and to go get revenue from businesses. There's a whole sort of government spiel of people's opinions on that. We won't dive into it and things like that. But most businesses are just trying to do the very best they can and say, hey, I'm trying to follow the laws. I'm trying to do what I need to do to make sure I'm trying to be compliant. The joy of America is that each state can do it own differently. Each city, each county can do it differently. If you're not happy with where you're living or the laws, you can always move to a different place. That was one of the things, I was able to benefit from. I said, hey, I wanted to move from Oregon that had income tax, and I moved to a state that didn't have income tax, right? And that's the joy of America, is that you have that capability. But from tax and sales tax complexity, it is a nightmare. It makes it very complex.
It does.
So that's where, as a business, try to do your very best to be, to follow, being compliant. So that way, when the auditor comes, you have everything and all your bases matched, and you'll be okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that is perfect. One thing I would ask you, if people are interested in just knowing more about your, application that you guys have with CereTax and how it all works, what would be the next steps for kind of evaluating that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love, reach out to me. Obviously, you can find me on LinkedIn, the sales tax guy. Feel free to email me. My email's on my LinkedIn, or you try to give me a call. I'm not too hard to get reached. I try to make myself fairly well known out there and an easy reach. But yeah, reach out to us. Say, hey, I'm interested in learning more about a sales tax solution. We'll be able to meet, learn what software you're using, what your business is doing, where your complexities lies, and what you need to be able to automate it and make sure that you're taken care of. And then we'll be able to figure out the pricing for you and make sure it makes sense, and that you're happy with the solution. And we'll be able to help take care of you and make sure you're compliant.
Yeah. And I think the biggest thing to note too, it doesn't matter where you are in the stage of your business either. You could have just started, you could be 5 years in, it doesn't matter.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's a big
absolutely.
thing. Cool. Any last takeaways that you have for people that are in the sales tax questioning room and whatnot?
Yeah, I think most importantly is sales tax is very complex. It's not an easy world to try to do on your own. I've done one or two little small businesses on the side. I've tried to set up software. I've tried to file a sales tax return myself. It is very complex, and when you don't know what you don't know, it's a nightmare to try to do it with all the other things on your plate. The best thing to do that I found, at least most time effective, cost effective, is to reach out to someone that has experience, knows what they're doing, ask for help, right? Whether that is trying to register your state for sales tax in a business, whether you need to file a sales tax return, set up software to be able to calculate sales tax. Those are all things that I found best in my own personal life, just to find an expert that'd be able to do that. Obviously, I feel like I'm a great expert here in the sales tax world to be able to point you in the right direction if we can't help you, or to be able to make sure that your needs are taken care of. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tid. This was awesome. And hopefully everybody that, listened in or will listen over the weeks to come, that you find a lot of great value in this, because again, sales tax is complex. It's overwhelming. It's all of those things. But when you do have a good plan in place, it really helps alleviate some of the stress that comes with it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the time, Christy.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks everybody for being a part of this. We